Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining the Coalition for Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development for our panel on eviction diversion today. As you well know, since the pandemic started back, or since the public health emergency started back in March of 2020, we've been through multiple iterations of emergency changes to eviction protection laws in the District of Columbia. We've been through months of trying to improve the process for getting emergency rental assistance out to tens of thousands of tenants and their landlords in the District of Columbia. And we are still in the pandemic, and Stay DC will be closing soon. So there is still great need for talking about the short, medium, and long-term future of eviction diversion efforts in the District of Columbia. For that reason, we've brought together this panel of experts to talk about eviction diversion in the district. The panelists will discuss immediate eviction diversion concerns, as well as recommendations during the still ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And they will also provide recommendations for long-term strategies for the district to mitigate the negative personal and social impacts of eviction. We are very fortunate today to have Peter Tatian, who is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute and research director for Urban Greater DC, as our moderator. Peter is an expert on US housing policy, particularly in the areas of housing assistance and affordable housing preservation. In his role with Urban Greater DC, he has been a longtime collaborator with CNHED on the DC Preservation Network, and we consider him the expert on DC affordable housing data. Peter is particularly well suited for his role as moderator today because he is the facilitator of the Eviction Diversion Working Group for the District of Columbia, which was initiated after a White House summit on eviction diversion. And so I'm going to turn it over to Peter Tatian now, who's going to introduce the rest of the panelists and lead us through the discussion today. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Scott. Appreciate that introduction. Thank you to you and CNHED for hosting this discussion today. And so I'm very pleased to be moderating the panel discussion on this important topic of eviction diversion. And before I turn to our panelists, I'm going to just give a little brief context for the conversation today. So starting with talking about what we mean by eviction. So as defined by the Eviction Lab, an eviction is when a landlord expels someone from a property he or she owns. So evictions are landlord initiated involuntary moves that happen to renters, but the process of evicting someone is long and can be complex and has enormous personal and social costs for tenants, for landlords, and for the community. So eviction and forced moves have devastating and immediate impacts on all members of a displaced household. To give a few examples, workers are more likely to lose jobs after an eviction, and eviction has been associated with poor school performance and more mental distress among children, as well as mental distress for adults. Evicted families can also lose housing assistance, creating long-term risk of homelessness and housing instability. But eviction costs society as well. So first, there is the cost of the eviction process itself, but beyond that, evictions can increase the need for more homelessness services, more medical services, social services, to address some of the challenges that evicted people and families face. And evictions cost landlords as well. These costs include missed rent payments, legal fees, unit turnover costs, and lost revenue from having housing that's vacant. Furthermore, eviction has often not been a fair and equitable process. Researchers at Georgetown University found that between 2014 and 18, the rate of eviction filings was 25 out of 100 renters in DC's Ward 8, which has a population that's 92% Black, compared to only 3 out of 100 renters in Ward 2, where the population is 13% Black. In addition, the rate of executed evictions, which means where tenants are actually moved out of their homes, was 13 times higher in Ward 8 than in Ward 2. And the researchers found a strong correlation between the percentage of residents who are Black in DC tract and the rate of filed and executed eviction cases. So reducing the number of eviction filings and preventing avoidable evictions, especially in communities of color, is in everyone's best interest. And evictions can take place for a variety of reasons under DC law, but according to the same Georgetown study, about 90% of evictions in the district between 2014 and 2018 were a result of landlords alleging non-payment of rent by tenants. The COVID pandemic has only made this worse. Renters have lost income because of job losses or reduced hours, making it difficult or impossible for many of them to keep up with rent payments. Census Pulse data that has been analyzed by Urban Institute found that over much of the past year, between 10 to 20% of all DC renters had little confidence they could pay their rent or had already deferred a rent payment. But those percentages were notably higher for Black and Latinx renters in DC, more than half of whom in some weeks said they had difficulty paying their rent. So to respond to this crisis, the federal government made emergency rental assistance funding available for communities to distribute to tenants and landlords in need. DC distributes this assistance through the Stay DC program. And in fact, DC ranked first in the country in disbursement of these emergency rental assistance dollars per capita and second for total overall disbursement. As of October 6th, $146 million in rental assistance has been distributed to over 26,000 tenants, and about $8.3 million has been paid in utility assistance to about 8,000 tenants through the Stay DC program. And 90% of that assistance is going to people who are at or below 50% of the area median income. So the good news about that is that a lot of money is getting into the hands of people who need it. The flip side of that is that we are rapidly running out of this federal assistance money. And so as hopefully many of you are aware, Stay DC announced that it will stop accepting applications on October 27th, so next week. And while there's some hope that we will get additional federal funding, there's no definite timeline for whether any more federal funding is going to be coming. In addition, DC's moratorium on the filing of new eviction cases phased out last week. So eviction filings are proceeding again with a 60-day notice. And the council has passed some emergency legislation to address some of the concerns, including providing a delay period for people who have pending applications in Stay DC. So that's all, just some basic background for today. Our panelists will get into a lot more details on all that. But the subject for today is eviction diversion, which aims to prevent evictions through a variety of means, including things like legal representation, rental assistance, and mediation between landlords and tenants. And we have a fantastic panel today to discuss what is going on currently with eviction diversion in DC and what steps we need to take to strengthen that system. So let me introduce each of our panelists, starting with Beth Mellon, who is the supervising attorney in the Housing Law Unit of the Legal Aid Society of the District of Columbia and the Director of Legal Aid's Eviction Defense Project. Beth represents clients in landlord-tenant matters in DC Superior Court and the DC Court of Appeals, and she also litigates claims before administrative bodies like the DC Housing Authority and the Office of Administrative Hearings. Beth is also active in policy advocacy and is a member of the DC Superior Court Landlord and Tenant Advisory Rules Subcommittee. Arianna Royster is an Executive Vice President at Borger Management and Director of Multifamily Housing Management there. She's a licensed real estate agent in DC and a member of the Board of Directors of the Apartment and Office Building Association of Metropolitan Washington, AOBA, where she previously served as president. Arianna also serves on committees of the National Apartment Association, as well as the local chapter of the Institute of Real Estate Management. and she teaches various marketing and management courses on behalf of the National Apartment Association and Montgomery College. Marion Siegel is the Executive Director of Housing Counseling Services, Inc. Founded in 1972, HCS provides comprehensive housing counseling, training, advocacy, and technical assistance for low and moderate income homebuyers, homeowners, tenants, and the homeless to help them achieve successful living in healthy, safe, and affordable homes. Under Marion's leadership, HCS has established robust partnerships between area nonprofits, private industry leaders, developers, lenders, legal service providers, and government agencies to create, implement, and evaluate programs, policies, and procedures that are focused on equal access to good housing opportunities and equity. And finally, Daniel Del Pielago is organizing director for Empower DC. Daniel was born in Peru and immigrated to the DC metro area in 1980. For the past 15 years, he's been organizing with communities of color here in the district around issues of preserving and improving affordable housing and traditional public education. In his role as organizing director, Daniel hopes to support his staff organizers in pushing their campaigns and the organization forward as a whole. So please join me in welcoming our panelists today, and we're looking forward to a great conversation. So I'm going to start by posing some questions to the panelists. But we will have time at the end for audience questions as well. And so if you have questions as we go along, feel free to put them in the chat. And Scott Bruton will be helping me to sort through those so that we can address as many of your questions as possible at the end. Great. All right, so let's get started. I wanted to turn to each of our panelists and ask them to give us a brief sense of, from their own unique perspectives, what is going on currently with evictions in DC today? So where do we find ourselves right now? So let me start with Beth to give us her update on things that she's seeing.
Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you for setting the stage for our conversation. And I do want to just lift up and continue to lift up that this really is a race equity issue and an issue that's devastating communities of color in the district. The latest census pulse survey data has about 25,000 households behind on their rent, and 98% of them are headed by a Black or Latinx tenant. So I think just let's keep bearing that in mind as we have this conversation and the affordable housing crisis in DC that preceded the pandemic and why we are where we are. In terms of where we are on evictions, actual evictions started for the first time in a year and a half on September 13th. We have about 500 families who were scheduled or are scheduled now through November 18th for eviction. And that has been ongoing in those weeks. And then, as Peter mentioned, new non-payment of rent cases were able to be filed as of last Tuesday. We have not seen many filings yet. We've seen a few dozen. And my belief about that others can share their theories, is that the court has not yet updated its forms in terms of changes in the law that were made, and they have not given a lot of guidance to landlords about what they need to file to show that they are complying with the law. And so I think, at least some landlords are waiting to get that guidance so that they can ensure when they file cases that they won't be dismissed for failure to comply with some of the new legal requirements. And I hope we can talk more about this, and Marian can certainly speak to this as well. But we have had a really great, and I should say Daniel as well, we have had a great coming together of organizers and canvassers at organizations like Empower DC and many others, with housing counseling services, helping with rental assistance, and with legal service providers at Legal Aid and a host of other organizations providing the legal services needed in court to try to stop these evictions that are scheduled, and are having a pretty good success that about half of these evictions so far have been stopped with payments or the promise of payments. And that may not sound like a lot. I know I you know, half isn't good enough when we're talking about families being displaced and the terrible harm of eviction that Peter noted. But I think we have never before been as organized and coordinated as we are right now. And so, you know, that effort has resulted in something really real and tangible for families. And I think that's wonderful.
Great, thank you so much, Beth. Marion, can you give us your perspective on where things are today?
Sure. Let me talk a little bit about financial assistance, which is obviously the first line of defense for many families who are at risk for eviction, and that too has been a moving target. There's been about 6 different programs established and closed during the pandemic already for financial assistance, and some working in the background to support families who are in need of financial assistance. Obviously, the one that we all talk about and know most about is the Stay DC program, which again, to reiterate, is planning to close its doors on October 27th. In the background to that have been other financial assistance programs that have assisted through the early stages of the pandemic. There was the CHAP program, there was the TBRA program, there's all these different programs that really we have to recognize the city's efforts to quickly put some things in place. None of them perfect, but they were pretty responsive early on and trying to navigate this with tremendous resources, but limited time and capabilities. And then for most of us know the long-term district funded program, the ERAP program, which has been a support system over time, but has always been very much insufficient at meeting the need of rental assistance in the district. And that program has now been offline, more or less offline for many months now. I know HCS ourselves, we ran out of ERAP funds in January, and we're just getting new ERAP funds in today. So as rental assistance has been there as a resource and a tremendous resource with the federal treasury funds, with that now coming to a close, we have a whole different scene that we need to consider in establishing a viable eviction diversion program. Stay DC had its good points, Stay DC had its negative points. And we'll talk a little bit more, I think, later in this conversation about kind of where it has been and should we get more resources, where we might consider it going. I must also commend not only the great partnership that Beth's already talked about, all the community groups, all the legal service organizations, all the housing assistance organizations, the case managers and everybody else, but there were staff members and managers from government agencies driving around checks to make sure that evictions were stopped. And I don't like to forget to mention that as well. So, and the judges and this was really a community effort, and keeping this conversation going at forums like this, which many of us are very involved with, will hopefully look for some solutions, and we'll continue that later today. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Marion, for sharing that recognition of all those efforts. And yes, I hope we'll talk more about some of that. Arianna, can you give us a perspective from the landlord point of view? What do things look like today regarding DC evictions?
Thank you, Peter. I appreciate being invited on this panel to talk about the landlord's perspective. Oftentimes we don't get together. It always seems like a us versus them type of scenario. So I'm really pleased that we were invited to share some thoughts with you today. In terms of the landlord perspective, I think that we could share with Miriam some of the pain points that DC Stay provided to us, because I'll say initially, at least from my perspective as a landlord, eviction is the last option. I don't think that most of the landlords that AOBA represents want to have eviction as a first step. We too are sensitive to the families that will be displaced as a result of an eviction occurring. So we do try to mitigate the steps before the eviction occurring as far as working with our residents. With the Stay DC program, my company, for example, filed about 450 applications on behalf of the residents. And we had an all hands on deck approach to filing those applications. We have Spanish-speaking Spanish-speaking employees in our office, and we deployed them to our sites to help some of the residents that we knew were going to have some challenges. All of our community managers reached out to the residents that they knew were behind in rent. And we started with payment agreements before payment agreements were mandated by the city. So we tried to be proactive. We tried to be communicative with our residents to figure out, how we make this work. How do we assist you in becoming current, or at least trying to make some payments on your rental accounts? I will say that I wish the communication between landlords and residents were better. There's always this fear that, the landlord may be trying to set you up for something, which is not the case, because obviously we'd like to collect the money. And if there is assistance to help you collect the money, we're all for it. And so that's been our approach. Prior to the pandemic, we try to work with our residents in advance. So if your rent's not paid, we're reaching out to you. Hey, what's going on? What can we help you with? How can we resolve this? Because we know that once you are 1 month behind and then 2 months behind, it becomes extremely difficult to be able to catch up. And so we'd like to try to work it out when the issue first occurs.
Great, thank you, Arianna. I think everyone appreciates that proactive approach that you described. Daniel, you are and your teams are out talking directly with people, trying to engage with them on this issue. Some of them, of course, may not want to face up to the enormous reality that potential eviction can be. So what is it that you're seeing through your work and the work of your team?
Thank you for that question, Peter, and thank you to CNHED for having me and us today here on this panel. It's really concerning, and as Beth mentioned, it's made very clear the problems that have existed for a very long time. Folks are scared when we speak with folks. Folks are concerned about not only the rent that they've fallen behind back during COVID, but previous to that, right? Like a lot of folks are just, trying to get a little bit closer to good by availing themselves of programs like Stay. But there is a lot of fear out there around, what happens now if Stay is running out, if my application isn't approved, and just the general unknown, right? I think we've had to shift to digital platforms for a lot of this type of work, right? If that's why we have tried to kind of cover some ground in helping connect folks to technology, right? Like literally like helping folks establish an email address so we can apply and all those kind of things. And then of course the court process, as much as I know right now, is all on digital platforms. So there's a lot of fear of, not knowing what to do. And then of course that results in eviction. So there is a whole lot of concern from folks about where do I turn to, where do I go, and what will I do next? And I think, our work has really been to try to connect to those folks who we would make it our good argument need it the most, need support the most. And so we've been trying to target public housing residents, areas in the city that are low income, that people, are faced with the digital divide. So yeah, it's tough. Folks are really scared. Just yesterday, we were helping out. We did an event in Ivy City to help folks connect to Stay. and a senior showed up, and he was like, well, I hope I can get this little bit covered, and then we'll deal with the rest when we have to deal with it. So it's those kind of stories that I'm sure are not unique to this one gentleman, that once again, folks are scared, and I think we have responded to it. And I think not to throw the city under the bus or anything, because there has been a collective effort to try to help, but I think there's still a lot more that needs to be done.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Yeah, indeed, a lot more that needs to be done. So I wanted to, for my next question, start with you, and just asking, what do we need to be doing to better get help out to people who are most vulnerable? What are some of the things we need to be doing right now?
Yeah, it's been interesting. We've been on some national calls, and we hear discussion about like strong social media campaigns and email and all that. And we've been in the carryouts, we've been in the buildings. Like, you have to get in the buildings, you have to get into the businesses that people frequent, right? We recently held an event at People's Congregational Church, and we asked, how did you hear about this? And people said, oh, we saw a flyer in the laundromat, which we left one. We saw it at the carryout. We saw it in our building. So while I think there is, some benefit to social media, email, and all those kind of things, nothing replaces the face-to-face, getting in the buildings as much as possible. We were over there by North Capitol Street, and even a lot of, and this is a good thing, a lot of apartment buildings tend to be locked. The front doors will be locked, so it makes it hard to access the buildings, unless you kind of wait till somebody comes in or out. But we were sliding flyers under the doors, hoping that people would receive them and get them. And they have, we tend to ask those questions at the events that we've been holding, how did you hear about it? And people will say, we saw the flyer. So I think that that approach has been good for us, and I think we can amplify that. And we have been, I think both Marian and Beth spoke to this, right? Like the collaboration that's been happening has been really great, because it's allowed for more people to get in the buildings and out on the street.
Great, thank you. Let me invite others on the panel to share thoughts about what we need to be doing to get help to people right now.
I would agree totally with Daniel. I mean, we have used every method. HCS has been calling everybody on the eviction list, sending emails, I know legal service providers have been sending out flyers for a long time, but ultimately door knocking, having meetings, getting the word out through word of mouth has been the most effective for the people who need it the most. Again, if we look at the people who applied early on to stay DC, I think we would find a slightly different demographic than what you might be seeing now.
Mm-hmm.
I will say, Peter, I know the court is not here today, but something that's been very helpful, we have been working with the court to get data on, when writs are issued in cases. We're going to work on that with new filings, and we've done a lot to try to share data. So sharing data with the canvassers in terms of scheduled eviction dates, working with the Marshal Service to get that data more directly, sharing things with housing counseling services. And there's a government side to the data aspect, and those are things we're discussing very much. I mean, I will just say, you may not be looking for the broader answer, Peter, but just, to take a step back. Jimmy McMillan was this activist who ran for governor in New York, and, his phrase was, the rent is too damn high. And I think we just have to remember the rent in DC is too damn high. And that's the challenge that our community faces to prevent further displacement, to prevent the district from, continuing to change in terms of who is able to live here. And so I think we are doing all this great collaborative effort, but with rental assistance running out and just continuing to face an affordability crisis and the economic fallout from the pandemic, we just have to keep all that in mind, that there's the short term, but we really have to keep focusing and working the long-term solutions, and we need them quick. We can't wait years to put things in place, because the district is changing every day, week, month, and year.
So I would like to add, Peter, that from a landlord's perspective, we were doing the same thing. We were sending out information about the Stay DC program, constantly reminding residents and posting about the Stay DC program. And so it's interesting that the three of the other panelists talk about the collaboration. And the piece that I feel like was missing is with housing providers. So Daniel, you were saying the buildings were locked and you weren't able to get in. If it were one of my buildings, it would have been great to receive a phone call and we would have absolutely, allowed you in. And so I think that when we're thinking about eviction diversion, we've got to think about introducing housing providers into those conversations, because I am totally open and willing to partner with your organizations. And that's, one of the points that I'll bring out later is how do we collaborate to help you help our residents?
Great, thanks. Sorry, Marion, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add where we did collaborate with landlords, we had great success. And we had great numbers of tenants participating. And I think Empower DC also had that experience. And so I agree with you 100%. The collaboration with property owners will increase access. And the one thing that we didn't talk about in how do we make sure more people hear about it, it's not just how to hear about it, but how to access it. And that's where almost the bigger challenge has been. So we can put up all the billboards we want, but if people are unable to access what's being offered, which in many situations was what we were experiencing, which is why HCS, Empower DC, and many other groups went around the city and did application events, not just here's how you apply, but actually help people apply. And that was an important component as well.
Yeah, I will just add, if I can, Peter, is just, I very much agree, Arianna, with the sentiment. And, look, there are cases where we're in court and the landlords are agreeing to stays to get the money in place. And so a family won't be evicted. But I think we have to keep in mind there are landlords who are not. There are families who were evicted and had pending applications for rental assistance. And part of why that happened and the court ruled against that is because the landlord refused to consent to a few more weeks to wait for that money to come through. So, we absolutely see both sides of that issue, but the collaboration, including even in the court process between the landlords and tenants always is helpful. We always welcome that.
And I'll just add briefly, we did have a successful partnership with the Horning Brothers where we worked together in doing the outreach and actually filling out the applications. And I agree, we just have to maximize those type of relationships.
Great, thank you all for that. And I think that leads, Arianna, I know you wanted to talk a bit more about some of the partnership between residents and landlords and some of the things that you're seeing in the housing provider community that are great innovations, maybe that others can learn from and emulate. So is there some more you can share with us about that?
Sure. I first want to talk about dispelling some of the stereotypes. Because the stereotype of your typical landlord is that there's this rich old guy, and that's not always true. We represent families, we represent individuals who have, spent a good portion of their life trying to invest in housing. And so it's their retirement, and they're not necessarily rich, but they have sacrificed and used that as a means to take care of themselves. And then you also have teachers' unions that are represented by brokers who invest in real estate for the pension funds for teachers, the teachers' union or postal unions. And so just trying to get people to understand that there is many faces of a landlord. And don't get me wrong, I understand that there are landlords that don't always treat tenants well, but we like to represent and make sure that we educate some of the smaller landlords on policies and things that you can do to have some collaboration with the residents. And so with with our particular portfolio and through AOBA, we would love to glean from the tenant advocates how to engage in a better relationship with our residents. And not only that, as I mentioned earlier, how do we collaborate with some of the tenant advocates, and how do we go about reaching out to the CBOs? Because our expertise is in providing housing, not the wraparound services. And so if we could bring all of that together, I think that it would be a better experience for the resident. And I will admit, we don't have that piece of the puzzle. I don't know how to reach out. I don't know what CBOs to reach out to provide the assistance to our residents. And to take it a step further, maybe inviting some of them in to talk to the residents to say, hey, maybe you should talk with your landlord if you're struggling and you all are able to work out some type of arrangement before it becomes a legal and adversarial situation. So I think if we can do some work on the front end, it would make it better for all those involved, and we won't have to go down the eviction path.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Beth, did you want
I was just going to say that, I know we're talking about eviction diversion, and I know a lot of us have been thinking about, Arianna, to your point about just a framework of what does that mean? What does that look like? What are all of the kind of supports and interventions and so forth to put in place? And certainly early outreach, to tenants, being able to, talk to tenants about their rights and their concerns about landlords, for example, concerns about conditions and how to make those known and how to approach those issues, is certainly part of what we see as an overall strategy and solution. And I mean, that our doors are always open to talk about these things and figure out ways to collaborate with AOBA and others. But I also do want to go back to Daniel's point about the fear, because, it's also true that throughout the pandemic, landlords, have some landlords, and often not AOBA members, to be candid and frank, have been down at the council pushing for immediate evictions and pushing for things in the middle of the pandemic. And so I think figuring out how to partner, as Daniel mentioned as well, partner as much as we can and kind of talk on both sides and understand each other's point of views across the community and how to approach this as a community problem and a community solution. All of that is great. And we are always happy to have those conversations and think about how to put all of that into a framework for what a real, a successful eviction diversion prevention model for the district would look like.
Great, thanks, Beth. And actually that leads me to, I was going to next turn to you to ask a little bit more about when we talk about eviction diversion, as I mentioned earlier, that can include a lot of things, and you and I and Marion and others are, as part of the working group, are trying to think through what those things might be. So could you get us started thinking a little bit about what you think should be part of eviction diversion in DC? What does that look like?
Yeah, no, this is great. And y'all are going to get tired of me being a broken record and saying, I think we always just have to start from that point of unaffordability, with a deep impact on Black and Brown communities in particular. And then we talk about, okay, so where do we go? Because we have some challenges that any framework of other things cannot fully address. But we have been looking at what kinds of collaborations and what kind of network can we build up to support tenants. And one way to look at that as a time frame is, as Arianna was saying, like we want to intervene before court process, before it comes to that. But I think we are framing it more as who are the players, what are the services, what are the supports? And I can give you some examples. So beyond kind of know your rights and education and reaching out to tenants early, if tenants, for example, qualify for public benefits that they are not receiving, that is an income issue that potentially can be addressed. Of course, if there's rental assistance that is, available, that can be provided potentially before court. There are other challenges that tenants may be facing that lead to an eviction situation. And so understanding if there's an allegation about conduct, what are the landlord's concerns? Are there ways the tenant can address that? Some tenants want to move or are ready to move, but don't have, and I know there's a question in the chat related to this, may not have the supports they need to make that move, given that they may not have a strong credit record. They may have other challenges in finding a new place to live and need some support to navigate that process. And then there are legal services that come into play. And, you know, sometimes we encounter tenants before the court process. And I'm going to give a few examples that are not non-payment of rent, but we may have an individual who has a dog. The dog is an emotional support animal related to a mental health condition or situation that the landlord may not be aware of and the tenant may have wanted to keep private. And when the issue is raised, you know, then the tenant can be advised about a way to approach that with the help of legal services to make the landlord aware of the situation, to make a request for a reasonable accommodation based on a disability as an option. And so there are lots of ways I think that legal services getting involved early can potentially help resolve some situations. But going back to Peter, 90% of the cases are about rent. We just have some challenges there that when affordability is a challenge and when rental assistance is not available, there are things we can do, but we face some really kind of steep limits, I think, in our ability to address underlying issues. And I just want to, you know, be honest and clear about that.
And just to reiterate what Beth said, and something that's my mantra in almost every meeting that I attend, is the basic problem really is the mismatch between the cost of housing and people's incomes. And that is never going to be solved through emergency rental assistance, yet it's what we've kept throwing at the problem. ERAP, which was here well before Stay DC, was designed originally, I was involved in the original design of that program. It was originally designed as a temporary response to a one-time emergency where someone couldn't pay their rent for a month or two while they got back on their feet and could prove to us that they could pay their rent going forward. ERAP was sent, was expected to resolve the problem. In reality, because of that basic mismatch of housing costs and income, it became a long-term subsidy for many families and was almost like a lottery in order to access it. So really redefining what the resources are used for and how to put a better program together where there is an emergency response and there is a long-term response, I think is important for a new way of looking at this and putting resources towards the reality of what's needed out there rather than throwing emergency response where it's not an emergency, it's a reality.
Great, thank you. Daniel, Arianna, is there anything you would like to see in terms of better eviction diversion in DC? What should be, what are things that should be part of that system? Do you have any thoughts to add on that?
You know, I think our local government needs to step up and identify funding. I mean, we need it, and I agree with Marion. You know, we can't just keep solving emergencies. All those are immediate and necessary. We do need to look like at a long-term strategy on, you know, how can our local government help support people who really need it, right? Like once, you know, people's stay, you know, check cashes and they're okay for a little bit, you know, there's still the unknown future. You know, what will happen? Will folks be able to return to work? So once again, I think looking at a new way. I think we've been talking a lot about collaboration and forging like new relationships. Like just yesterday, I was surprised. Like we were getting leases emailed and texted to us from smaller landlords. But that's, you know, that's something that really hasn't happened in the past, at least in my personal experience, right? So I think we have to realize that we've changed. We have changed, and we need to keep building those systems that allow us to protect people from, ending up on the streets.
Yeah, I think I agree and echo all of the sentiments in terms of, trying to solve a long-term problem with a short-term solution. And one of the things that we have to also consider is the cost associated with building new housing. And so when you talk about affordable housing, the cost of lumber and the cost of drywall is the same for a luxury building or an affordable building. And the cost that the district imposes upon builders and developers in terms of meeting compliance requirements is a huge, huge cost. And so we've got to figure that out as well. How do we encourage developers and how to build in a time where, as we all know, inflation is going to be setting in, and how do we do that to make it economically feasible? And on top of that, then maintaining the buildings. So thinking about when the pandemic first hit and everyone worked from home, and the cost associated with running electricity all day long, and the increased trash pickup, and the increased wear and tear on the building, increased personnel cost, but you're not receiving rent. And so you have to make those things work. And just like with some of our, let me not make that comparison, but some of our buildings, it was very difficult to try and maintain the expenses that were associated with not being able to collect rent, because rent covers all of the things that we talked about. And there are increases on electricity, there's water increases, there are insurance increases. And so all those things cost the landlord money. And in terms of talking about collaboration, yeah, let's figure out how we can still provide great services and be able to afford them, be able to afford to pay for them at the same time.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think you're all just emphasizing that there's some basic underlying structural problems that we all face, and the collaboration is good, but we need to figure out how we crack some of those underlying challenges as well. So definitely appreciate that. And I think CNHED is one of the great forums for having those kinds of discussions about how we can do that better. I wanted to ask next about, so as I said, we don't know yet about getting more federal money for emergency rental assistance, but we do know that there are plenty of people out there still who need it. And so that we hope that more is going to be forthcoming soon, and the mayor has publicly asked for it. But what do we need to, if we do get more money, what should we do differently than what did we learn from the experience over the past several months with State EC, and what might we want to change? And so Marion, I'll start with you on that question.
Sure. Well, I take this question pretty seriously, because part of what I think we should do differently is we as advocates made it very important to ensure that the hurdles for applying for rental assistance were reduced. And in some ways, some of the hurdles were, from my point of view, reduced too low. When now, maybe early in the pandemic, that wasn't necessarily the case, but I want to make sure that the money is going to the people that need it most, and that's not always what I see. So that's one whole thing, is to look again about what to require people to document in order to qualify for rental assistance. Should somebody with a large bank account be able to access rental assistance? in the current state DC program, assets aren't even considered a reason you don't qualify. So having another look now that we're at a different stage, less of a physical emergency as we were in the past, so re-looking at that. A second whole part that was left out of this, again, because of the emergency nature that we were working within, was ERAP required a certain amount of counseling, case management, reviews of budgets, help in making sure that you could pay rent going forward. And because we were in such an emergency mode, that hasn't been offered to people. So we haven't had the time or the ability to sit down with somebody and say, let's solve this rental emergency. Let's get that off of your back. And let's talk about how you stabilize yourself going forward, what skill sets would be helpful to you, what support systems, what legal advice, what advocacy, what can help you as an individual stabilize going forward. And we need to get back working individually, family by family, renter by renter, and looking at that and putting some resource into that. I think that will help. Housing counseling services has been in the courtroom since since evictions began again, actually since before evictions began again, to make sure the judges wanted to make sure that renters facing eviction had access to a certified housing counselor in the court. So far, we've been 100% focused on making sure that last mile payment is made to divert the eviction. Once state DC isn't there, we'll still be in the court. There'll still be a housing counselor in the court. There'll still be attorneys in the court to make sure that other resources are brought to bear to prevent these evictions, and that needs to be continued.
Great, thank you, Marion. Any other thoughts about what have we learned from state DC that lessons we should apply going forward if we get some more money for rental assistance?
I do hope, Peter, in response to that question, that the district government will be willing to release more data about who was assisted, to Marion's point, because I think income is only one slice of that. And so understanding, for example, the rent levels of the different tenants who applied and were approved for assistance. I think we see a range of folks right now coming out of the pandemic who may currently have no income or have had no income for a period of time. And it ranges from, someone who is a recent graduate student with a PhD who hasn't gotten, a next job yet, to families who have been struggling for years in unaffordable, housing. And I think that thinking about ways to, from the data we already have, understand who we helped, how much money did different households get, and how can we do better? And then thinking about going forward, how do we target, for example, Ward 7 and 8 neighborhoods and communities, and you can get down to the census tract level, where we know that there are many individuals who have been severely rent burdened for years, who are most likely to face the risk of an eviction filing and an actual eviction and so forth. And so how can we make sure the funds are going there? And I think the other thing would just be more geographic data. I know they've released information by ward, but it's even a little more complicated than that. And so I think trying to pull apart that data to understand who did we help, how did we miss the boat, what are we going to do next time if we get this opportunity for more money, to really target that money to the families most in need. And that's something that legal service providers with our services, do every single day. And it's hard. And I wish we had unlimited resources so we didn't have to make those choices. But I think if we have limited resources, we need to be very careful and thoughtful about making those choices.
So in terms of what we do better, I think that we do have to look at the requirements. We have to lower the barrier for people who have the least amount of resources in terms of providing them the access. And that's one of the things that we talked about we did. You know, we created or helped create email addresses for people. So lowering those barriers, but also the communication piece. And what we are currently struggling with is residents who owe 10 or more months worth of rent, and we filed applications on their behalf, but they haven't filled out their part and they haven't communicated with us when we've reached out on why, you know, how can we help you? And that's a big part of, I would think, the eviction diversion. If you owe rent and here's money available to help you so that we don't have to take the next step, how do we get you to communicate with us so that we can avoid that? And I think right now that's our biggest challenge and our biggest area of funds owed, where we have people who just will not communicate in terms of how do we get this money to you and help you avoid the legal process and or going a step further, the eviction process. And that's where we're struggling right now.
I would agree with everyone who's spoken. I would only add that I would hope that we know that unfortunately people will be evicted. So I hope that that is being tracked. I mean, I think it's being tracked by organizations, but what are we going to do about that, right? Like there are people that are going to end up on the street. So we're doing a lot of this upfront work to hopefully stop people from being evicted, or at least give them a little more time to try to get right on the rent and so on. But you know, what happens after, I think, is a question that we're going to have to wrestle with as well.
And based on the city's fear at the early stages of trying to get money out the door and meeting the Treasury deadline, I think their decision to go electronic was vital at some stage, but to recognize that the people who need it most needed some humanity and some hand-holding and some eyeball-to-eyeball contact. And there's this lack of understanding that making a new email address doesn't make you communicate by email better. If you don't use email, if you don't use electronic platforms, just because you have that email address, it didn't solve your rental assistance problem. And so bringing this all back to the humanity and the support systems, and recognizing that data is vital, and backroom data systems and perhaps portals are vital in managing the systems. But when you're talking about human beings with human problems and our own human foibles, you need a different approach in order to reach the people who need it most. And to go back to that, I think, is important.
Great, thank you very much, Marian. And yeah, I actually volunteer as a free tax preparer for folks in the district, and because we know we need that human help for folks who do their tax returns. And I think the state EC application sometimes looks more complicated to me than some of the tax returns I've done. So
it is.
So yeah, we have to recognize that's going to be an important element, that people are going to need that assistance from actual live people. So, and I know all of you on the panel and others who are listening today have been a vital part of providing that assistance. So thank you for that. I think the last question I had, and then we'll turn to the audience questions, is just, you know, I think we've talked a lot today about some of the different collaborations that, you know, some were in place before, but many others kind of emerged from this process. And so maybe one of the good things we can look at over the past several months is that increased collaboration. So any thoughts about how we keep that going in the future and make sure that we don't lose that positive spirit of working together?
Peter, if you don't mind me jumping in just to maybe give a few examples. And part of the council's response to this has been to add funding for legal services and our nonprofit partners. And that money, that application process has not started yet, but we are certainly looking at that. So not just, legal aid and all of our legal service partners, but Empower and all of our, tenant organizing, counseling, canvassing partners, but also looking at these other issues like public benefits, debt collection, tax issues, everything that we can do beyond just rental assistance and subsidies, which are the backbone to, help families that are struggling to have more resources. And I know there's a commitment in the nonprofit community to continuing these collaborations, but we need to recognize they take resources. And so I think having available funds, to be able to devote time, not just to the direct work, but to maintaining those relationships and collaborations. One simple example is that there are 6 legal services quickly organizations bred for the city of the DC Bar Pro Bono Center, Legal Aid, Legal Counsel for the Elderly, the Neighborhood Legal Services Program, Rising for Justice, did it in alphabetical order, thank you, who, we all help tenants facing eviction. We were able to create one intake line for tenants during the pandemic to get that on court notices, to get it in the council legislation. But that takes resources, and we need a better online platform and the resources to support it. And so those are the kinds of things we're looking at, is how can we step up using available resources to really deepen our collaboration amongst each other, to cut down the barriers that tenants face, and to make everything as accessible and low barrier and so forth as possible, and equitable, and really focus on, race and other equities that need to be a part of that process.
I'll chime in. I mean, there's so many examples of the new partnerships that have developed during this time. Housing Counseling Services and Empower DC are doing joint pop-ups now. I mean, we've always done them separately, but by doing them jointly, we've used the skills of the different organizations to better focus on better outcomes, and it's been very successful. We've been working with landlords all over town to do pop-ups at their events. We're working on a program with W.C. Smith on a on-time rental payment and match savings program to support tenants who, now that we might bring them current, if they continue to make on-time payments, they're going to get a match savings that includes both philanthropy and landlord contribution. So again, back to those kind of partnerships, there's all kinds of examples that have taken place. Where, several of us are meeting in various different forums to see how to formalize some of them, how to make sure that once the courts reopen, that in the courthouse are resources available on all of these things, on food insecurity, on rental assistance, so that you come in for being delinquent on your rent. Well, probably you're food insecure as well. So how do we make sure those resources are available? And those linkages are happening, and it's time to formalize them. And I think that we are working towards that. And I think that the successes we've had in the last couple of months will perhaps engage philanthropy and thinking about it with us more, as well as our government partners. I mean, I've never been closer to the Department of Human Services. I have an hour meeting with them every day to make sure every eviction that can be stopped is stopped. And that's taking government interest as well, and they're intimately involved. So those are all important linkages.
Yeah, I would add that, I think we're making connections and relationships that are broader than our immediate work, like specifically around housing and housing protection. So, for example, because stay is ending, we had stay pop-up events planned through November, but we're having to pivot and figure out how can we support tenants, how can we support renters, residents that are faced with these type of issues. So like we're working with Mothers, Mothers Network, Mothers Outreach Network, who are doing work around the child tax credit to make sure that families with children avail themselves of that benefit. So I think for us to just look broader and cast a wider net in the relationships that we make and forge and keep that going and making them stronger.
I think I'll say that this was a good start. Having the dialogue between the housing provider and the CBOs and housing counseling services. So hopefully it doesn't stop here. We'll continue to have this dialogue and work together on, how we best serve our residents.
Great, thank you all very much. Well, let's turn to some of the audience questions then. We've been getting several questions as we've been talking, so I'm going to basically take them in order. So starting with a question about what advice do you have for a family scheduled for eviction? The family has a Section 8 voucher, but no landlord will accept them because of bad credit scores.
Well, first of all, let's stop the eviction. We can work on pre and post-pandemic payments that are expedited to stop the eviction. So first and foremost, let's not play a game of musical chairs. Let's keep people in their homes. It does nobody any good to look at moving out. In terms of credit scores, in terms of general housing search processes, that goes back to the mismatch of income and housing costs. There is certainly the need to consider that when somebody has a voucher, past credit history should not impact their ability to pay now that they have their subsidy. And I would strongly support strong legislation to make that very clear, and to support tenants in their housing search on how to present that to landlords.
Great, thank you, Marian. Next, I think is a fairly straightforward question. Are landlords currently able to file for eviction for reasons other than non-payment of rent, such as lease violations?
Yeah, so I should have mentioned that at the top, that they are not able to file those types of cases until January 1st, 2022. However, as of the end of September, landlords were able to issue 30-day notices or similar types of notices to tenants in those cases. So tenants certainly should understand, if they get one of those court notices, that they do not have to move out immediately. They can talk to legal services. I'm going to put the number for the Landlord Tenant Legal Assistance Network, which is the single point of entry for intake, in the chat for everyone. And we are always happy to talk to tenants in any of these situations and provide them with legal advice on what they can do to deal with the current situation that they're in.
Can I just add something that came to mind is, we haven't talked about self-eviction. Daniel talked about the fear that tenants are feeling, and that can easily lead to self-eviction. People thinking, I'll never get this $20,000 rental assistance payment in time, so I might as well just leave. In all cases, we want to discourage that. There's often, right now there's still rental assistance. Their ERAP will exist in some form or another after October 27th for rental assistance. So please discourage tenants from self-evicting. Please get them to get legal advice and counseling advice before they take any such action.
Yep, and thank you. I wanted to note that Beth has put in the chat information. Any tenant who needs legal help, especially tenants with scheduled eviction dates, call the Landlord Tenant Legal Assistance Line, 202-780-2575 for help. So thank you, Beth, for sharing that. Okay, what can families do who are behind on their rent portion and not eligible for state DC, and they're not eligible for state DC, sorry, because they're already getting some subsidy from DHS and are on limited income, or trying to look for work and childcare during COVID-19?
There's very few reasons why they wouldn't be eligible for state DC. There are a very few number of specific programs that someone could get a subsidy for and not qualify, but most housing subsidies you can still qualify for state DC. So I want to make sure, there was some improper information put out early on. Most rental subsidies you could still qualify for state DC. So go ahead and apply October 27th. Be turned down, but apply, and take it from there.
The only thing I would add, Peter, is I know that the State DC call center has had some challenges in being able to respond to these kind of inquiries and always respond to them correctly. And so I would encourage tenants who have that question to actually call the Landlord Tenant Legal Assistance Network, because there is some complication in that, and we want to make sure that they get the right answer and they understand. And, you know, understandably, the call center is not always in the best place to answer those questions.
And just to summarize the other basic qualifications, if you had loss of income due to the pandemic or increased expenses due to the pandemic, and I would say most of us had increased food costs, many of us had increased childcare costs, transportation costs. So most people qualify as having been impacted economically by the pandemic.
Great, thank you both. Next question, how do you, the professional assistance community, deal with bad actors, people who are gaming the system and taking advantage of DC's pro-tenant policies? I once had to evict a person who was well known at DHCD for using her expansive knowledge of the system to live free. Is this a significant dynamic in DC?
I mean, I would say I dealt with one this morning. So it's not significant. The number is tiny compared to the need out there, but it does happen. And when it does happen, tenants who might be taking advantage of rental assistance and they might not qualify, or for whatever reason, it will be stopped, it will be investigated, it will be repaid. But it's a very, I mean, I deal with we in the last couple of months, just Stay DC, I think we did 500 applications, just Stay DC. And the number that seem shady is less than 5.
Great, thanks, Marian. This person had a second question, which was, how do your strategies vary from families to individuals? Is there any difference in how you approach them?
I mean, not really, except for obviously when there are small children or physically disabled or ill people, we try a little bit harder just because our hearts are in it in a different way. But no, there's no difference.
I will just lift up Peter in terms of, you know, from a data perspective, in addition to what we've talked about, you know, in particular, Black residents of the district being so disproportionately impacted by this. The single greatest risk factor for facing eviction when you control for everything else is having children in your home. And so I think it's important for us to understand that eviction is a crisis that uniquely impacts families with children in the home.
Yes, thank you, Beth, for reminding us of that. Okay, this next question. My owner reached out to me and asked for my assistance to help get tenants to apply for the Stay DC program. He said that tenants owe him rent, but they won't apply for the program. So any advice dealing with this situation, tenant reluctance to apply?
CBOs, Housing Counseling Services, and Power DC, we'd all be happy to reach out to anybody who you want us to reach out to.
Okay, great. So
I think Daniel might have been ready to add into that, but yes, you know,
yeah,
sometimes.
no, exactly. I think, you know, we are open to supporting folks. You know, folks will come and they'll say, I don't even know if they're going to pay. And I'm like, if you don't apply, you definitely will not get anything. You know, let's get it in and see what happens. So yeah, we'd be happy to help. Thank you.
There was a question about what percentage of housing providers or landlords are, quote, small landlords. My understanding is the majority are large landlords. I did share in the chat, so I actually have done some numbers to try to estimate that for DC, and estimated that about out of rental properties in DC is about 8,800 properties, about 26,000 units belong to entities that own fewer than 20 units. I don't know, Arianna, if you have any other insight into that question, but I did share some data on that for this person.
I was not prepared for that, so I do not have those statistics. Okay. I know AOBA probably does.
All right. any ideas on building more apartments and making them including existing apartments more affordable for eligible families?
One quick, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, we have the inclusionary zoning program. So when you're building new apartments, most of them do include an affordability component with the inclusionary zoning.
And I would just add is preserving housing that is already what we consider naturally occurring affordable housing is more important sometimes than building new units at 80% AMI. The clients we're talking about that we're reaching out to, they couldn't afford an IZ unit in most cases. They couldn't afford to move to a newly built subsidized trust fund property. Their income is too low. And so while we can certainly recognize the city's efforts to increase the trust fund and increase the number of affordable units through new construction, the loss of the naturally occurring affordable units is happening at a much greater pace than what can be replaced that way. So we need to look at other methods, including subsidies, direct subsidies, and preservation efforts.
Yeah, on the trust fund, and I know the folks on, this meeting, I am just telling you what you probably already know, but the goal for units that are affordable to 0 to 30% has been missed year after year after year after year, and those tenants are the most severely rent burdened in the District of Columbia. And I'll let Daniel say something about the Housing Authority if he wants to jump in there. But I think when we're talking about affordable housing, affordable to who and at what income level is very important. And so, there are various things we can do, including tenant-based subsidies and, other solutions as well. It's not just about construction or preservation, but I think we also need to make sure if our law says half of that money is supposed to go to the tenants most in need, we need to figure out how to get there and stay there.
Thank you, Beth. I don't want to paint this with a a broad brush, but there's been kind of the theory of like, let's knock it down and we'll rebuild it, and people will come back. And people have not come back. People are not coming back. So we do have to hold on to what we have. I think as Arianna mentioned a little earlier, it is expensive to build new buildings. It's getting more expensive. That holds projects back. And what we've seen is, especially in public housing, people not being able to return because these projects are simply not getting off the ground. So while I think there is something to be said about potentially building new truly affordable housing, like affordable to who, as Beth said, we need to hold on to what we have.
Great, thank you. I think this is really more of a comment that there's an important role for project-based and sponsor-based local rent supplement program, which provides operating subsidies for affordable housing in which residents cannot afford market rents. So I think certainly many of us would agree with that. Very important part of that affordable housing solution that we are all talking about. Let's see, just looks for the next question here. We have a question. The application has been a challenge for some of the east of the river residents in DC. Will you mention where the next pop-up will take place in Wards 7 and 8?
I can say that it's every day. It's held at the DHCD Resource Center. I think it's from 8:30 to 3:30 is my memory. So there's somebody in that resource center every day that will help residents complete applications. I know Empower DC and HCS have one coming up next Tuesday. I'm not sure which, you can go onto the website. There'll be some others posted, I'm sure. But those are the ones I know about. Daniel, you know where the Tuesday one is, I don't.
Yeah, we have one on Tuesday at New Macedonia Church. I think it's off Alabama Avenue. You can go on our website, empowerdc.org, to see the full details. I'm sorry, I just don't have it right in front of me. But we will be there. Because it's the day before the deadline, we will be filling out applications as much as possible. So we encourage folks to come out, and they can reach out to us for more details.
Yeah, anything anybody can do to knock on doors this weekend, help people fill out the application. This is it. This is the last push. Everybody, we all need to do this together to get as many applications in as possible before October 27th. HCS is trying to focus on those with writs and judgments to make sure those all get in. If everybody can help with everybody else out there, that would be wonderful.
Great, thank you. What happens to people who have already applied for assistance but are in the review stage?
Those will still be processed. There's no guarantee that everybody who submits there will be enough money for, but just because the portal is closing down, there's still processing and payments, plenty of them still going out. They closed the portal because they looked at the backlog in the portal and did the math to determine they will use all the money. So don't worry, if you're in the portal, you're in the portal. But the only other thing I would say to that is, and I've talked about this during pop-ups, is this is the time to overemphasize documentation for new applications. If you have something in the portal and wasn't fully documented, you use self-certifications or didn't add everything, those will go to the back of the line. The easy ones will get through first. So if you're helping people apply right now, over-document the application. Don't rely on the self-certifications right now and hope that their money holds out before yours is reviewed.
Peter, the only thing I would add is just tenants should know any tenant with a writ, which is the court order for an eviction or scheduled eviction date, even if they've applied, should immediately contact the Landlord Tenant Legal Assistance Network to get in touch with a lawyer just to make sure they understand how to make sure that the court process did not move forward while that application moves forward towards payment. And we also can help with, making the connection to rental assistance and just making sure that process is on track.
Great, thank you. We have another question. What are some examples of the loss of naturally occurring affordable housing? What neighborhoods or areas, for example?
I call it the ocean of naturally occurring affordable housing. If you look through much of east of the river, you're seeing neighborhoods filled with 20, 24 unit buildings that are owned by small landlords that are now starting to be bought up. The examples are endless. So again, we have the wonderful TOPA law, which is now untold. So moving forward at this point. So, the other hat that I wear is doing preservation work and tenant organizing to prevent the loss of units where properties are being sold. And there's tremendous efforts going into organizing tenants associations, organizing tenants to purchase their properties, organizing tenants to partner with affordable developers to try and preserve as many of these units as possible.
Yeah, one thing to keep in mind there too is DC has a rent stabilization law, but it has limits. So 2, 3, 4 unit buildings, if they're owned by a landlord who doesn't have additional units, are not covered. Buildings built 1976 and on are not covered. And especially on the back end of that, some of those buildings, may be affordable, at certain levels, but without rent stabilization, there's no mechanism to control the rent increases. And so that is something that the council can also look at in terms of ways to stabilize rents and keep affordable properties affordable for the long term.
When you look at the game of musical chairs that we talked about a little bit as far as keeping tenants in their homes, that it's in everybody's best interest, we find even in working with affordable housing developers who try to so many for-profit and nonprofit housing developers need that extra housing subsidy to keep the units affordable. And so what we find happening all too often is tenants without subsidy get displaced and other poor families, low-income families with subsidy replace them. So still there's this game of musical chairs.
Yes, indeed. And many people have referred to the housing assistance lottery, that it's great if you can win the lottery, but for those who can't, they're in a very hard position. So, well, I think we're just about ready to wrap up here. So, and I see Scott has reappeared, so taking that as a signal that we've come to the end of our discussion. But I really want to thank the panelists for sharing all of their insights and knowledge today. And I know we could probably talk a lot longer about this topic, and that we will. But thank you all, and thanks to our audience for attending and for sharing your questions with us.
And on behalf of CNHED, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and our moderator for participating today. I think it was a very worthwhile discussion. CNHED and the months going forward will look for other ways that we can help facilitate greater dialogue and collaboration between all the folks doing this work on the front lines, you know, on the tenant side as well as the housing provider side, so that we can continue trying to make progress on improving eviction diversion efforts legally, through policies, and through funding. I will say that there have been some questions. Yes, we have recorded this. If you RSVP'd for the event, you will be getting a follow-up thank you email for attending, which will include the link. We encourage you to share it with your friends. And again, thank you so much to the panelists. We really appreciate your time and efforts. We know that you all have very busy schedules and are engaged in very important work. So thank you all very much, and we wish you all a good afternoon.